Coming up, a trio of veterans continues to lead the Nets to more wins than fans would probably like. A front court rotation nears full strength, potentially forcing Jordi Fernandez into some difficult lineup decisions, and the trade chatter continues. I'll dive into all that and more after the theme music. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast and the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And before we get into anything, if you do not already, go subscribe to Believe in Nets wherever you get your podcasts, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Most importantly, go to YouTube. Go to my channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you don't. If you're watching this video and you enjoy, hit the like button, please. Leave a comment. Anything you can do to engage. Really appreciate that. But today we're going to be talking about this Nets team continuing to exceed expectations, coming off a 116-115 win over the Charlotte Hornets. This is, I think, 3 games since we last potted, and the 2 games before that were back-to-back losses to the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden on Friday and Sunday, the first of which the Nets nearly climbed out of a 21-point hole and took the lead in the final 10 seconds before Jalen Brunson hit a 3 on the other end to win the game for the Knicks. The second game, the Nets lost handedly, but then they come back against Charlotte and they win this game, a 17-point comeback. We're down in the second quarter by that much, and they win this game despite leading scorer Cam Thomas being sidelined. Cam started to experience some lower back tightness during the first half of the second Knicks game and then was a late scratch for this Hornets matchup. And I think this win really exemplifies the way a trio of Nets veterans are raising the team's floor early this season and probably positioning themselves in a place, if the Nets were to hold on to these guys, where they don't want to be in terms of their draft position, because this win brings the Nets to 6-9 on the season. If the season ended today, they would have the 11th worst record in the league, so the 11th best odds in the draft lottery, which, for a team that just blew up their situation this summer, traded a lot of stuff to get their pick back in this draft, which by all accounts is loaded at the top, something I'm also going to talk about later on. I do not think that's where you want to be, obviously. And 3 veterans have really played a essential role to this team performing above expectations. And that's obviously Cam Johnson, Dennis Schroeder, and Dorian Finney-Smith. 3 guys that I have talked about throughout the beginning of this season. Schroeder in particular came on really hot, but lately it's been the wing duo of Johnson and Finney-Smith who are elevating this team. On nights where some of the other guys might not have it, these guys have been consistent for now close to a 10-game stretch, and it's really elevating to this team to a point where they can compete on more nights than you would have expected them to entering the season. So I want to start out talking about Cam Johnson, who's a guy who obviously last year struggled with injuries the entire season, never really got to full strength, and performed well below where people would have hoped or thought that he might have after signing that 4-year, $95 million contract with the Nets. So a lot of people talking about how that contract might age poorly. I was a little hesitant on that because I knew, the extent to which the cap is going to rise over these next 3 years with the new TV deal. And I thought that Cam did have potential. I covered the extensive list of injuries that Cam, had last season. He tweaked his hamstring going into the year. Then he had an adductor thing. He had a calf thing. He had an ankle thing. He had all these different injuries throughout the year that never let him get to full strength, which are a legitimate concern because Cam has been injured a decent amount throughout his career, but he's been healthy to start this year after a full offseason with no setbacks of just getting back into shape and full strength. And he's really playing like one of the better wings in the NBA, especially over this recent stretch. I said Cam Thomas sidelined for this Hornets game. What does Cam Johnson do? The Nets need somebody to step up. He scores 34 points on 11 of 12 shooting from the field and 6 of 12 from 3. That's 4 off of his career high. Johnson, over the last 8 games, Cam Johnson is averaging 20 points per game on 53, 46, 97 shooting splits. And he's really, as I said, elevating this team's wing play to a point where they have a chance on a consistent basis. A lot of it just due to his 3-point shooting because he's shooting the ball at such a high level. 46% over the Nets' last 8 games on high volume. And, he's actually doing a lot more than I think some people maybe thought he could or expected entering this year because, Mikal Bridges departs and Cam is stepping into a situation where the team, there's a lot of buzz about them wanting to trade him. But in the meantime, to start this season, the Nets don't have a lot of shot creation. So Cam is stepping into an expanded offensive role. And, I said entering the year talking about the team and why I think they would struggle, just looking at the shot creators. Who are the guys that are comfortable creating their own shot? Who are the guys that can do a little bit more than just spotting up and needing everything else to be created for them? Obviously, Cam Thomas was the number one guy in that situation. I said, Dennis Schroeder is probably the number two behind him. And I said Johnson obviously could be in that conversation, but I probably didn't give him as much of a look or a thought as I should have, because Cam has done a lot more than just spot up for threes, early on with this Nets team. He's shown those flashes of self-creation. He's shown those flashes of being able to curl off screens or attack closeouts and either drive to the basket or occasionally pull up in the mid-range. You look at what Cam's doing this year. He's shooting 76% at the rim this season, Cam Johnson. That's a career high. So bottom line, this guy is playing very, very high-level basketball right now. It's elevating the Nets floor, and it's also going to have an impact on his trade value, as I'm going to touch on now for Dorian Finney-Smith, another guy who started off the season pretty poorly, I think the first 3 or 4 games of the year, and has bounced back in a big way. Dorian what did he put up? In this Charlotte game, put up 15 points on 4 of 5 shooting from 3. He's averaging 11.2 points per game while shooting 42.5% from 3 on 5.6 attempts per game. Those are all career highs across the board. And, when you talk about these two guys, and Dennis Schroeder also, because, I've covered Dennis extensively, but Dennis had 14 points and 12 assists in this Charlotte win, really set the table and controlled things in Cam Thomas's absence. And I don't need to get more because he's cooled off after a hot start, but still for the year has been playing very high level basketball. And talking about these three guys and how well they're playing, these are three guys that could be playing themselves off the team, because if you look at the correlation of these things and how it's going, the better these three veterans play, the more the Nets are going to win. The more their drafted odds are then going to decrease. And the better they play, their trade value is also going to increase. So if the Nets draft odds are decreasing while these guys' trade value is increasing, I think there's a logical way that the Nets can benefit on both of those ends by capitalizing on that trade value and moving them, which in turn will decrease their draft odds and hopefully lead to them losing a lot more games if tanking is the goal here. So I think that it's pretty clear that these guys are going to have trade value, potentially more than we expected entering the year. I don't think that 11-game stretches, impact this in a huge way, like in Schroeder and Finney-Smith's situation. I don't think it's going to impact their, trade value a ton. I think it could help because they have both been playing pretty high-level basketball, so it could add a little bit. When you're talking about a guy like Cam Johnson, who just signed this contract, as I said, people didn't really know what he was going to be entering the season in terms of health. Early on, he has been healthy. He hasn't shown any signs of slowing down, and he's playing basketball at such a high level where it seems like if he can keep this pace up, he's going to cool off somewhat. But if he can stay somewhat on this track, he's a guy that could be a needle mover in a playoff rotation somewhat and could potentially swing a playoff game or two in a series with his, his shooting and all the other things that he's doing right now. So those guys I do think are going to have value. I talked with Mike Scotto on a recent podcast, throwing out some hypothetical trade scenarios. I said the Nets are probably going to be looking for, where I said the Nets, I think, would probably I'd expect them to get a first-round pick for Cam, maybe not even a premium first-round pick, maybe a later first-round pick. But now looking at this with the way that Johnson's been playing, I may have been selling him short. The Nets may be able to get a little bit more than that. He is making $23.6 million. So I think it could be tough because you're going to have to, if you're a team looking to acquire him, you're going to have to trade significant amount of salary plus probably a draft asset. So it might be more along the lines of getting maybe a young player that has some value plus that first round pick. Because what I've been hearing and what I've heard for a while now is that the Nets, if they were to trade Cam, are looking for the equivalent of 2 first-round picks. The equivalent. That doesn't mean 2 first-round picks. It means maybe a young player, maybe a couple of young players and a first-round pick. The equivalent of overall value of 2 firsts. That may have sounded a little outlandish entering the season based on how it played out with Johnson last year, but he's playing at such a high level right now. Like he's frankly if you're looking at him and Mikal Bridges, obviously who the Nets sent to the New York Knicks, Bridges is improving as of late, but Cam Johnson has looked like the far superior player, early on this season. I don't think he is the better player, obviously. And I think that Mikal is going to rebound and he'll probably lead the Knicks to winning a lot of games down the stretch of the season. But early on, if you're just looking at their numbers, Cam's true shooting and his effective field goal percentage are way higher than Mikal's on similar volume. And he's just doing a lot of stuff that, in terms of the 3-point shooting, that the Knicks obviously hoped that Mikal was going to do that he hasn't yet. So that's just, a comparison to show that Cam does have value and will be a guy in a rotation, potentially a playoff rotation, that I think will be able to have minutes and could play somewhat of a significant role for a team that's looking to really add a boost to their 3-point shooting and their wing corps. So those are 3 guys that the trade value or the trade buzz and the trade speculation is going to continue to grow. And I think that's significant because I asked Cam after the Charlotte game, we've asked them several times about how they block out the trade noise and all that stuff. Cam and Dorian both said entering the season that they had conversations with Sean Marks this summer about their uncertain futures and just, about having transparency about the situation. Sean said that they have an open door policy. They can come in and talk about stuff. And they really do seem comfortable and I'd say even happy in the situation. Like, I asked Cam about, the trade speculation and all the stuff about this Hornets game just because he's been playing so well. And he said all the things you'd expect him to say of like, it doesn't affect us. All 3 of us have been traded before. We know how to deal with all that stuff. But the end of his answer I thought was significant because Cam said, hey man, like we like playing with each other. Like we like this group and we like the way that we're playing here with the Nets. And as long as we're in Brooklyn, we're going to continue to play hard and we're going to continue to try to represent Brooklyn. And I thought that was a significant answer because people saw the Nets entering the season as a tanking team, and you have these veterans like Johnson, Finney-Smith, and Schroeder, Bojan Bogdanovic, a guy who hasn't played yet, but like saw those guys, and it's like, oh, like poor those guys. Like it might be like a woe is me situation. Like we're stuck on this tanking team. Like a lot of times when you see veterans who, even for a short amount of time, are stuck on this tanking team but might get out, like they're miserable. They don't want to be in that situation. They want to be on a contender. They want to get moved to a situation where they can try to compete. That isn't the case with these Nets veterans. And, I think that's partially a testament to the Nets organization, from the front office to the coaching staff, how they've handled it and making them feel comfortable. And I think it's an even bigger testament to the type of players that these guys are, because you look at Cam, Dennis, Dorian, like it may sound cliche, but these are like team first guys. These are guys that really care about what the team is doing. They're not individualistic at all. They're not selfish in any way. And I really do genuinely believe them when they say that they're happy here and they like the way they're playing. Like Dorian has never said anything along the lines of wanting to be traded. Cam has just said that he likes being here. And, as long as he's here, he's going to be happy and keep playing hard. And even before the Mikal trade and after it, Dennis Schroeder has said that he wants to be with the Nets long term, which isn't surprising for a guy who's changed teams 7 times in the last 7 seasons. So I think a good thing for the Nets organization, a good thing for these, good representation of these players. And I think people around the league, whether you buy it or not, I do think they see that guys look happy here. And even in a tanking situation, right now they are able to get a lot or close to the most out of these guys and have them just in a situation where they seem happy and the vibes are not terrible. So will Sean Marks buy into those vibes and keep these guys around? I haven't bought it since the beginning of season that would happen, and I'm still not buying it. And I do think that he's going to field offers for these guys. And I do think that it's getting to a point where, like, Cam has 2 years left on his contract after this season. Dennis isn't expiring. Dorian has the player option after the season. So you thought that there might be the urgency to trade Dennis or Dorian because they are expiring contracts in that sense. And Cam has 2 more years. So you might not have to trade him. You could hold on. You could do all this stuff. But with the way that Cam's playing right now and, his history of injury, if he's able to stay healthy leading up to the trade deadline and is able to keep playing at anywhere close to this level, I just think you have to move him because he's playing so well that he's going to have real value. And he's in, a hot streak and a health streak that you really just want to capitalize on, because if you hold on to him past this season or past the trade deadline, if his play starts to level up, if there's injury concerns there, you're just missing out on a boat that there's really no reason to miss out on, because Cam, he's 28 years old. You could say he's young enough to be like a bridge guy and lead the Nets into like the next phase of this rebuild, but the Nets should be in asset accumulation mode right now. And I just think with the way that Cam is playing and his health concerns, if he's able to stay on this track, you have to capitalize on the value that he's going to have, which will be real value if things keep going in this direction. So it's how I'm seeing all that. It is, tough from the situation if the Nets are in on the tank that they're winning more games than they should have. But as I said on my last podcast, like, these guys are increasing their trade value. So for Sean Marks, it's going to be about weighing that balance of increasing the trade value versus hurting their draft pick. And I think it's pretty clear which one of those will be more important. But, as we've said numerous times, December 15th, usually the start of trade season, that date. So we'll see leading up to that how it's going to go, and going to have more trade talk in a little bit here. But another thing I want to touch on from this Charlotte game is the Nets getting some health back with Trendon Watford returned for his first game of the season on Sunday against the Knicks. And then he returns in this one, and he makes 2 game-winning plays down the stretch of this game. Like, Trendon closed this game and he scored 7 points in the final 2 minutes, I think it was. And then he scored 2, back-to-back baskets around like the 1 minute mark to, give the Nets this win. They gave him the ball in the post against, I think it was Trey Mann who was covering him, which is obviously a mismatch, but he's able to score 2 buckets and one, and then another kind of like off balance acrobatic layup. And that wins the game. And Trendon obviously had been out since a hamstring injury since early in training camp, but he puts up 10 points, 4 rebounds, 1 assist, 1 steal, 2 blocks, 3 of 6 shooting, 4 of 5 free throws in this one. And he was playing on a minutes restriction. He said that. I think he said it was 18 minutes. I asked him about it after the game. And then we ended up playing 19 minutes. And he ended up closing this game over Ben Simmons, who also had a good game in this one. Ben had 10 points, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, 5 of 8 shooting. But Trendon closes the game over Ben. It's not clear whether that was a decision, just a basketball decision, or whether Ben had hit his minutes limit. I think Ben played 26 in this one, so he might have hit his minutes limit. But Trendon was looking for his shot and was aggressive down the stretch of this game, which is more than you can usually say for Simmons, obviously, in a fourth quarter. So it really works out well for Watford, a guy who I think is an interesting player, obviously signed with the Nets last season. The opportunities were a little more limited than some people may have expected, but signs a $2.7 million qualifying offer with the Nets this summer, and now he gets back healthy and is an interesting prospect. Like, he's a 6'8" guy. He can handle the ball. He can defend. He can pass. He obviously has a nice touch around the rim, whether on floaters or layups and all that stuff. If he can expand his three-point shooting a little bit and become like somewhat of a legitimate floor spacing threat, I think he could be an interesting rotation guy outside of just like that gadget player, but a guy who's in a contract season and is playing for a contract, obviously. And I think it will be interesting to see how the Nets utilize him and how they view him, especially as it pertains to Ben Simmons, because the front court update that I really want to get to now is Nick Claxton. I should have said this at the top, but the Nets have been playing without Nick Claxton for the last 3 games because he suffered a lower back strain and he received an epidural, which I think was a little surprising to some people to see, like, oh, he received an epidural. Like, that sounds like a serious back injury. But now Claxton returned to practice and is expected to return, or is questionable to return for Friday's game against the Philadelphia 76ers. So they're expecting him back. And then Day'Ron Sharpe, who's been out since early in training camp with a hamstring injury, also received an update. The Nets said that he has begun one-on-one workouts with coaches, and he's expected to be reintegrated to team activities in the next 7 to 10 days. So Day'Ron should be returning to game action, I'd say, probably within the next 2 weeks. The Nets are getting Claxton back. They just got Watford back. And I think that it's an interesting conversation as it pertains to Ben Simmons because, Ben's a point guard, but Ben's like really been playing like a front court point center role for this team. He's been playing in a 5-out offense. He started the first 8 games of the year with Nick Claxton progressing back from that hamstring injury, but then Clax came back and Jordi Fernandez moved Ben to the bench because he hasn't wanted to play Ben and Nick together for obvious reasons. Like, I went through that entering the season, why I think that doesn't make sense. And he obviously feels the same way. The Nets have been winning the math game on the 3-point shot a lot this season. That's been the number one reason for them performing above expectations. So Jordi doesn't want to play Ben alongside a non-shooting center and Nick Claxton. So he's moved him to the bench, and Ben's kind of captained that second unit, or he's captained the unit opposite Claxton as that, transition ball handler, half-court screener and roller, like a point center role is what I like to call it. That's fine and well, but now Day'Ron Sharpe is returning from injury, and you have a center entering the final season of his rookie contract, another non-shooting center in Day'Ron Sharpe, who played well last season. really showed flashes of being a legitimate backup center in the NBA, and is 23 years old, could potentially have a future with this team, could potentially be a trade piece for this team. But either way, whether you expect to sign him after the season or whether you want to trade him, I think you want to play him this year where he can either build up that trade value or you can get a sense of where he is and whether you want to bring him back. And Ben Simmons is kind of in the way of that equation because, as I said, Day'Ron's a non-shooting center. Nick Claxton, you have him starting at center when he's healthy. So where are the minutes coming for Ben there? Because Jordi Fernandez hasn't wanted to play him alongside a non-shooting center in Nick Claxton. Is he going to want to play him alongside a non-shooting center in Day'Ron Sharpe, where I think that's only going to hurt Sharpe's development? So something's got to give there. Like, somebody's minutes are going to decrease. Like, either Sharpe's going to get less minutes or Simmons going to get less minutes. They're going to split those. But then it also becomes interesting because beyond that, you got Trendon Watford, who, isn't a center, but I wouldn't call him a floor spacer. He's 6'8", likes to handle the ball, does a lot of things similar to Simmons, although Simmons is obviously a far superior passer. So, all of that, it just gets like, you might not call Simmons and Trendon Watford front court players because they're ball handlers, but in the archetype of being, not 3-point shooters, guys who handle the ball a lot, like they are somewhat fitting into the front court equation, at least how I see it. So now you got Claxton, Sharpe, Simmons, and then you got Watford too, like all in this equation. Something's got to give. Like, where is that going to go? And, Jordy has wanted to be committed to playing Simmons this season. Simmons, I think, turned in one of his better games of the year during the Charlotte matchup. The game before against the Knicks on Sunday was his worst game of the season. He was scoreless on 0 of 3 shooting. He had a few plays that were really bad in terms of, the lack of aggressiveness. And obviously, like, I've been over it ad nauseum, Ben's lack of aggressiveness, him looking for his own shot as a self-creator, just being aggressive, going to the basket in transition to the half court. It hasn't happened. Like, Ben's taken, I've said it, 4 free throws this season. I asked Fernandez about it before the Charlotte game, and he said, he's good at avoiding fouls, or, it's kind of a weird answer. And then he said that he likes his playmaking and that Ben pushes the ball in transition and he thinks that he makes them better. And, I don't doubt that Ben does things that make the Nets better, and he contributes to a way that Fernandez does want to play in that 5-out system. If he doesn't have the center alongside him, he does push the ball and he sprays to shooters and they play faster, something that they do need to do in the full court. And all that is well and good. But, it is in that 5-out system, as I said. And now you're bringing Sharpe into this equation. There's going to be less opportunities to play that 5-out system, assuming you're trying to get Sharpe minutes. So there's that. And there's also Fernandez saying that he makes them better. Like, that's just not true this season. Offensively, or defensively, he has not made the Nets better. Like, I put the numbers up, I think, before the Charlotte game when I wrote about his Fernandez's response to the free throw question. Of the Nets have 8 players playing over 200 who have played over 200 minutes this season. And Ben is by far the worst offensive rating swing on off of those players. I think the Nets were scoring 7 points fewer per 100 possessions when Ben was on the floor. The next closest to that was like Zaire Williams, who was like 2.5, negative 2.5. And then everybody else was positive besides that. So like Dennis Schroeder was like a plus 12.2 offensive rating swing. Ben Simmons was like a -7. So he's not, in my opinion, he's not making them better right now. And I don't think there's harm in playing him the way that they have been, because there have been minutes for him and they've had a need for him in these last few games, especially with Claxton sideline. And before that was Sharpe and Watford sideline. But now you got Sharpe coming back. You got Watford coming back, 2 23-year-old guys who are interesting. And I don't know what's going to give or how that's going to work out in that situation. So it's just something to watch in the coming games as this Nets front court reaches full strength. How does Fernandez approach those bench reserve minutes, and how does he kind of allocate those, and what is he prioritizing there? Which I also think some of that obviously is coming from upper management and the front office. So will be interesting and will be a little bit telling in regard to maybe Watford and Sharpe and how they view those guys moving forward, with them set to hit free agency this summer. And the last thing I want to talk about is a little more trade chatter surrounding the Nets. We've obviously heard it about the veterans, the guys I just outlined. I've talked about it all the way leading up in the early this season. I also just talked about it just now. But now, on a recent podcast with Mike Scotto, I threw out the question when talking about guys who could potentially be moved at the trade deadline. The veterans were obvious. I said maybe Day'Ron Sharpe, because Day'Ron Sharpe is a guy who there was some trade chatter of over the summer. He's entering the final year of his rookie contract, and Sean Marks has traditionally liked to backfill the center position in the draft to keep those guys on rookie contracts and save money that way, because he's been good at finding centers in the draft. Another guy I threw out was Cam Thomas. Talking to Scotto, do you think Cam Thomas could potentially be a trade candidate? Because he did not reach a rookie scale extension with the Nets this summer. There's been a very, well-documented history of the Nets potentially not being the highest on Cam, with, the first 2 seasons of his career not playing. And then after they traded Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in his 3rd season, he was still on the bench, or his 2nd season, he was still on the bench the second half of that year. So I thought it was interesting. And then Sam Amick of The Athletic reported yesterday that Thomas is available for trade, and just what he wrote exactly, so there's nothing lost in translation. He said 4th-year gunner Cam Thomas failed to come to terms on an extension and is widely considered to be available for trade. And naturally, the response to this, amongst it gets aggregated in a million places, and the response of a lot of people like, oh, the Nets are trying to trade Cam Thomas, this and that. I don't think that's the case. Like, there's a big difference between available for trade and actively shopping. Like, those are 2 completely different things. And I don't think it should be news that Cam Thomas is available for trade, because every player on the Nets should be available for trade. There's, most players on every team are available for trade. There's few players that are considered truly untouchable. But if you're talking about just like available for trade, where you're not just looking for an outrageous return for them, like, every player on the Nets should be available. And I think the Nets should be taking calls for, because the Nets are in a rebuilding situation. They totally blew this up. The team, if they do it right in the tank, is going to be centered on an 18-year-old, and they're going to be building it out from there. Are there players that could be part of the long-term future here? Absolutely. But nobody should be set in stone to be a part of that future right now, especially if you're able to get something, to get a price that you deem to be above that player's value. And, in Cam Thomas's case, as I said, the Nets, how they feel about him has been, I don't want to say unclear. Early on, it seemed clear. Like, it didn't seem like they were too high on him, given the fact that they didn't play him after they traded Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. It was kind of like a little bit of a youth movement. They desperately needed scoring during the second half of that season. They didn't play him. He was coming down off the bench to begin last season with Spencer Dinwiddie starting over him. Midway through that season, his minutes, he moved in the starting lineup, but his minutes still continue to fluctuate, and his role wasn't solidified. Then Jacques Vaughn gets fired, and then Kevin Ollie steps in, and his role really is more solidified. Now, you could say Jacques Vaughn maybe just wasn't the biggest Cam Thomas fan, but I think it's fair to say that in those first few seasons, if the front office was super high on Cam Thomas and they really envisioned him as a core player moving forward, he would have been playing. That doesn't mean their opinion might not have changed or they might not have altered and he could still be a part of this moving forward. I'm just saying, if they were so avid about it back then, he would have been in the rotation, especially during the second half of that year after they traded Durant and Irving. So now it comes to an interesting conversation with him not reaching the rookie scale extension of, could he be moved? Could they look to cash in value? Because Cam has played well this season so far. I think he's at around 25 points per game. He's been more efficient than he has. Something I should have touched on before, but he put up 43 points on 16 of 22 shooting and 7 of 10 from 3 on Friday at the Garden. Just absolutely frying the Knicks defense with OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges and that wing duo going against him, just fried them. And now if you look at his efficiency, Cam's shooting about his true shooting percentage is about 60 this season. That's a career high. That's 3 points above league average, despite him taking 17 or 18 field goal attempts per game. So he's been playing well, and there is promise to it. But I do think there's still questions about his player archetype, how the Nets might view him long-term. Do I think he's going to get traded? I do not think he's going to get traded, to be clear. I think it's possible, is what I'm saying. I do think it's possible. I do think there is a scenario where a team could come and offer something to the Nets where they say, we'd rather take this package as opposed to paying Cam this summer. I think that that's realistic, but there's several reasons why I don't think it's going to happen. The first of which, I'm not sure if that team does exist who's going to offer the Nets something where they think that it's worth moving off of Cam right now, because, I've spoken to people around the league, and something that I've heard in the past, when teams have approached the Nets about a trade for Cam, the Nets, from what people have told me, were not offered a first-round pick at any point for Cam Thomas. So If they weren't offered that then, are they going to be offered that now? Maybe is it like a fake first, like one of those late firsts or protected firsts? Who knows? But the point being, the Nets in the past haven't gotten an offer for Cam Thomas that they deemed worth taking. Is that going to happen now? It's to be determined. But another reason that I don't think Cam's going to be traded is because the Nets are going to have an ability to probably bring him back on a good number. Because if you're looking at the way the Nets played this, Cam's going to hit restricted free agency this summer. So they're going to have the right to match any offer made to Cam from opposing teams. And if you're looking around at the cap space landscape, there's not a lot of teams that have cap space around the league. The Nets are the only team projected to have over $30 million in cap space next summer. They're going to lead the league by far. And then you look at the other teams that are going to have cap space. You know, you're talking about teams like Washington, Charlotte, Detroit. I think New Orleans, San Antonio might be in that conversation. Like, are any of those teams really fits for Cam? I don't see a team there. Like, they might try to throw an offer at him, but do I see a team that's going to get really aggressive and be pushing up to like that 25, 30 million AAV that maybe some people think Cam's going to get? I don't really see it. And for that reason, the value of Cam's deal might surprise some people. It might be lower than some of what you were expecting with the cap rising and all this stuff. The Nets may be able to get him on a good value deal or a lower value deal because there's not a ton of cap space and the Nets are controlling the cap space and they have, the right to match all those offers for Cam. So if the Nets are able to, get him on a good deal, because like the way they approach this with Cam is pretty much they weren't giving him the extension that maximizes their cap space for reasons that I've been over in the past, but they weren't going to extend him now. He can go into restricted free agency. He can see what teams are going to offer him, and then the Nets can come back and they can decide to match it or not match it. But for what I just laid out, I don't think there's going to be an offer out there for him that is just like this massive offer. So if the Nets are able to get him on a reasonable deal, whether a long-term or like a shorter-term deal that might be a little bit higher of a value because they're taking the back end off of it with like a 2 or a 3 year deal, if they can get him on that deal, they could have the value there with him. They can kind of see what he is. They can continue to develop him. If he continues to develop and they like him, they could keep him or they could flip him for value. And if he doesn't, if it's a shorter term deal or a lower value deal, like they're really no worse off because they had all that cap space to spend anyway, and they're not really hurting themselves. So do I think that Cam Thomas is available for trade? Yes. I think every Net is available for trade. Do I think he's going to get traded? I think it's possible, but I don't think so. And I think the main reason why is I think the Nets are going to be able to get him back on a reasonable number and kind of get more of an extended runway to see what he is, to see whether they think he could be a long-term fit for them or whether they could probably be able to flip him down the line for maybe something of the same value or even better because he locked in on a long-term contract that might be at a reasonable number. So a lot of smoke surrounding the Nets in the trade market. I think the veterans, I think there's a good chance that multiple or all of those guys are traded. And then when it comes to Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, Nick Claxton has creeped into the conversation. I think those guys will be a secondary priority. And I honestly, especially Thompson Claxton, would see them holding on to those guys past this season and kind of seeing what they have in them down the line. So that about does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. As I said at the top, if you guys enjoy this, subscribe to this podcast, all streaming platforms. Go to YouTube especially. Subscribe here, Erik Slater, NBA. If you're watching it here, like it, comment. If you're not, go to my YouTube channel, like, comment, subscribe, engage any way you can, and leave a comment on what you think about the Nets, what you think about what's going on. I'll try to address it. Leave a comment about my work. If you have any tips or suggestions for ways I can improve this product, I always appreciate all that. But the Nets got the Philadelphia 76ers on Friday, and then they're departing for a 3-game road trip. They're going to be in Sacramento, Golden State, and Phoenix. So 3 tough games there, and they're getting a little bit healthier. So a lot of interesting things to cover. Trade chatter is only going to increase, and I'll have all the coverage of that and more here on Believe in Nets. I'll talk to you guys soon.